give us your thoughts and your visions, and how do you find the statements released by FIFA recently in order to try to help with all the situations that came up and the ups and downs considering or concerning the COVID-19. So I give you the floor, sir, so you can just let us know your thoughts.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation, and I also like to greet everyone here. Special thanks also to other speakers and Mr. Dan de Jong, who is sharing us a little bit of his insights and his time with us. I think it's a very particular time. No one expected us to be facing this right now. So that's why we are all facing this uncertainty, and no one really can anticipate what's going to happen in the future. I think that for the time being, FIFA, UEFA, European Club Association, and other stakeholders have actually taken the lead and try to tackle and anticipate a little bit what can be done to protect clubs and other stakeholders. I think we will hear a little bit more from Mr. de Jong about this. As you know, FIFA issued some specific guidelines to try to help everyone involved to anticipate a little bit the first steps. At least no one really knows, I think, in the mid-long term what's going to happen, but at least we have a little bit some light as where to go in the short term, and that's a little bit what we're going to be speaking about here. I think there's three main topics that those guidelines addressed: expiring agreements and new agreements, agreements that cannot be performed as the parties originally anticipated, and registration periods. Mr. de Jong will start speaking about expiring agreements, new agreements, and also the ones that cannot be performed. So if you agree, we could share the floor with him.
Of course, thank you so much. And of course, we would love to hear from Mr. de Jong. Because actually these issues, the agreements and the expiry contracts and all this stuff, and also I believe salaries, cutting salaries or whatever, or the contracts, how to try to amend these contracts if possible. So I would love, of course, to hear from Mr. de Jong.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm happy to share some thoughts on this document that was issued. It's an important point. I would like to mention that it's only the first version of the document. It's a version applicable to the situation in which we are now today, in which football is suspended, in which competitions are suspended, but that we can expect further work to be undertaken by FIFA, because it goes without saying that this crisis, the financial impact thereof, goes further than the moment of suspension of the leagues. Even if the leagues will resume, being it with or without spectators, we will see a great financial damages impacting the business of clubs, and as a direct consequence thereof, also the possibilities clubs have to pay players, to pay transfer fees, and also to agree on new agreements as well as the existing ones to remain them in force. Now, the guidelines try to give recommendations in these issues, and said I would like to talk a bit about the two issues that Bernardo introduced relating to expiring contracts, so contracts expiring before the end of the actual season, as well as the impact of the crisis and the suspension on the leagues of the payments of salary and the entitlements of players. When it comes to the first point, the contracts expiring before the actual end date of the season, what FIFA does in this document, and I must admit it's not very easy to read, because the document, if you read it at first sight, it looks like they are binding parties to extend their contracts until the actual end of the season. So let's say the Egyptian season has to finish 2 months later than initially planned, then that could be interpreted as players being 2 months longer bound to the club. However, the legal reality, and it's also in a subtle way emphasized in this document, provides that it's merely a recommendation for the parties to extend their employment contract. So it's merely a suggestion, recommendation to player and club facing expiring contracts to mutually agree to extend the contract until the actual end date of the season. So what players cannot do is to say to clubs, because the season ends at a later stage, the contract also ends at the later stage. And equally, this applies to clubs. If you are as a club being faced with players that are leaving on X date before the end of the actual season, you would have to mutually agree with this player to prolong the contract. And if there's no agreement between the parties, it would basically provide that at the original end date of the contract, that the player will become a free agent, and that could consequently happen before the actual end of the season. Now, with regards to the payment salaries, that is a very interesting topic, and it also provides a bit of a change compared to the past of how FIFA took value of domestic laws in FIFA disputes. Because normally, if FIFA deals with a dispute, it's very reluctant to apply domestic law to the dispute at hand. Since they're aiming for uniform approaches in jurisprudence, they basically apply the jurisprudence of the FIFA dispute resolution chamber, which might actually contradict at some points provisions of domestic law. However, because what FIFA wanted to avoid in the matter at hand was the disputes between domestic players and clubs with foreign players would be adjudicated differently. So they wanted to have a harmonized approach between these two types of players. And on that basis, if FIFA educates a dispute in relation to outstanding salaries impacted by the COVID crisis, it would take into account national laws, national edicts issued by the government when determining whether the club legitimately did not pay the complete outstanding salaries as due to the player. Now, I'm not an expert of Egyptian law, I must admit, so I don't really know how this issue is being regulated in your country, but I can imagine that it is maybe not very clear, and that as a consequence thereof, you cannot really rely on national laws and regulations, and you would need to come up with other alternatives to agree with players on salary cuts during the suspension of the league. Now, FIFA also realized that in the document, and if you read it, it provides clear sort of guidelines stimulating negotiations between players and clubs on reductions of salaries. And of course, once an agreement is reached between a player and a club, such would be valid and binding and taken into account if any legal dispute would arise. Now, one thing that we had to push for a lot as clubs, because we said it can be that there's no national law which provides a clear answer on the entitlement to salaries. It can also be that in that case, the player and the club fail to come to a mutual agreement with each other on the reduction of salaries. We believe that there still should be a bit of room possible for a club to unilaterally, thus without the explicit agreement of the player, decrease the amount of salary payable to the player during the suspension of the league. Now, although I must say at first sight this looks good, because it allows a bit of an opening for unilateral salary reductions in light of the crisis, there are very strict criteria which have to be met by the club, or in relation to which the clubs would have to provide evidence in FIFA proceedings before FIFA would take into account these unilateral decisions. So a club would have to demonstrate how, from an economical point, is being impacted by the COVID crisis. it has to establish that the amount of salary reduction was proportionate. In other words, you cannot just simply say, well, because we don't play football anymore, the player is not entitled to any salary. I would highly doubt that such would be deemed valid by FIFA. Also, a requirement is that the club, in good faith, try to negotiate with players, with a group of players, or bilaterally on the reduction of the salary. In other words, before a club would be federally entitled to unilaterally decrease the amount of salaries, it would have to take in due diligence good steps, proper steps to come to an agreement with the player, and in that respect also provide economical grounds, so pure evidence evidencing the need of the salary reduction as such. I think this is it in a nutshell when we talk about the expiring contracts and the salary reductions. But I'm happy to answer any questions any one of you here might have.
I would suggest.
Okay, yes, Sharif now has to ask a question.
Yes, Dan. With regards to the regulation, so basically what is in a nutshell needs to be done is that the clubs need to start working with the stakeholders on finding the solutions, but nothing is binding to the club.
Correct. These guiding principles do is give a bit of insight of how, a framework and a recommendation. But in particular, when we talk about expiring agreements, they stimulate that these contracts should be extended, but it's not a legal and binding position of FIFA. And that's why if there's no agreement between the parties, there would be no court, and certainly not FIFA, who would deem that the player could be forced to extend the contract with the club, so to say.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was really very informative. And the point where you mentioned about, different national laws, different than the FIFA, of course. So let me take you, or excuse me, we'll have to go to Mr. Mohammed El-Mehairi, a senior legal advisor at CAS. Sorry, if we can go back to Bernardo to ask him also about this situation. What can these countries that have different rules, how can they apply this?
Again, thank you. But as Dan said, this is really on a case-by-case situation. I think probably the work that all the stakeholders did to reach these guidelines was immense. We can read a document of 16 pages, but that tried to comprise objective indications. But I think this is really a case-by-case situation. I can share just a little bit of we've been obviously contacted by some stakeholders, some potential clients, trying to understand, and mainly, for example, here in Portugal. And for example, in Portugal, what you have right now is you have what is called a layoff law, where general companies can use it to either reduce the contractual period of their employees, or even put some of them, let's say, suspend their employment contracts because the activity is also suspended. So the discussion was, is this applicable or not to football? And I think probably it's also what's going to happen in Egypt, in other countries, and all over, I think, Middle East and Egypt. And I think then what happened was, when the clubs understood that the national law was applicable, they didn't immediately start to impose it on players. I think they used the guidelines that were given and started negotiations with the players, with coaches, and everyone involved in professional football, so as to, we have this possibility to use national law, but it's very, very strict, let's find a solution between everyone and benefit the club, because the club has no income, so we need to reduce our expenses, but we also don't impose something very strict on football players because they have the salaries and they are instructed. So I think at least here the immediate experience has been the first step, really, let's find an agreement, but we need to have in the back of our minds national law. And I think for some players, it was obviously a little bit more difficult, especially the international players, because they're used to guide themselves by FIFA regulations and the international scope. And here you suddenly have a little bit of national law coming into the discussion, but basically I think everyone is trying to reach agreements with players instead of really imposing very strict reductions. And I think it would be interesting to see what my fellow speakers think about the Middle Eastern situation.
So Bernardo, let me ask you a certain question, because sometimes some clubs, okay, it's not only in Egypt or the Middle East, but all over the world. Sometimes, like when they have their contract, when they come to the contract with the player, okay, they insert a clause in which, of course, though they are aware, of course, of the national law, but they just insert a clause in which that if they reach a dispute between both parties, they refer back to FIFA. So they put FIFA just there, like it's, I mean, just to get out of the situation when they are. So what do you think about this? What would be the role of FIFA at this time?
I think then we need then answer to that. I think basically FIFA would, as a principle in the past, let's say before the situation, apply its own regulations, and as Dan said very well, be reluctant in applying national law. And I think in order to have an harmonized approach, basically what this guideline is saying is that with certain limits and as long as certain steps are verified, national law will be taken into account if applicable to football. So FIFA will still be competent to decide those disputes, but I think we have to have in mind that FIFA will accept if those national laws are properly applied to football. Correct, Dan?
No, nothing to add. Clear.
Yes.
So that's it. I think all over the world, FIFA will still be competent. It's not national courts, but FIFA will take into account what national law says about this specific situation.
Great. Bernardo, can you please carry on the other parts of the directives?
But I think we still have to discuss the new agreements, right? Dan, that would still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so I'll share it with Dan, and then I'll go to registrations.
All right.
If we talk about the new agreements, it provides the same sort of recommendation, and it also goes hand in hand with the expiring contracts. That new agreements, that it would be good for football, for stakeholders, that the new agreements would only enter into force following the end of the season. Now, I don't know how big the issue here is in Egypt, but I can imagine situations whereby clubs have signed agreements that enter into force on a specific date, and that because football is on hold, because the season is not ended in a lot of countries, you would see that the player cannot be registered even for the club. Because what we will see is that, and that's a particular European problem with the seasons covering 2 years, basically, not a calendar year season, is that FIFA has already expressed that the transfer window will only open after the end of the season. And I think Bernardo is going to speak a bit on the transfer issue, transfer window issue further. But I think that when we talk about sort of contracts entering into force, new contracts, I think also here the simple recommendation is that parties ideally should agree with each other that the contract would only enter into force as of the end of this season or at the beginning of next season. Because when being faced with players with expiring contracts, in particular those expiring contracts and have already signed with a new club, it will be beneficial if the players in such case would be allowed to finish the season with the former club, so to say. So slightly delay the entry into force of the new contract. But again, it's only a recommendation. Parties would have to amicably agree on such extensions, and it's nothing legally binding as to what FIFA proposes in these guidelines in this respect.
Exactly. So I'll jump in, and I think also being a little bit practical. I think here in Portugal, we've been hearing that, for example, some clubs that have players on loan, and those loans, the loan contracts would terminate on the 30th of June, because then you have the season ends and then the new registration window opens. For example, some of them apparently are already discussing that the players don't return to Portugal. So it's interesting. I think the guideline is trying to provide with some stability, that at least the competition goes on, if it goes on a level and with the same players, but at least you see that some coaches in mix of trying to finalize the season and prepare the next one are already telling some players that they don't need to return. So I think it's a good example of what Dan said, that we are facing these guidelines and recommendations, but then it's a case by case situation. And regarding the registrations, jumping in as well, I think in a very brief overview, the rule is that you have 2 registration periods, and the federations are the ones that set it. They set it normally at the beginning of the season. You have normally the window January transfer period, and then you have the summer transfer period. So what basically the guideline again that FIFA said is, if players and clubs agree to extend the contracts until the end of the season, that will be accepted. So maximum objective to try to provide stability and integrity to the competitions. And the ones that they will basically in general accept amendments to the registration periods, which means that if, for example, a registration period is already ongoing, FIFA will accept the amendment. Normally I would say that at this stage, the registration periods have already been approved. The federations have already informed FIFA of what they intend to do, because I think with some changes from one year to the other, and we had the example of the English Premier League last season, but normally the registration periods now have kind of become set. Basically, FIFA, I think, and the extension, we need to have in mind that for the time being, there has not been a change of the 16 weeks, and I think Dan can correct me if I'm mistaken, because at some point there's a lot of information saying that eventually the registration period could be extended for a very long period of time. And from what I can understand, what FIFA said in the guidelines is you can amend. For now, we need to respect the 16 weeks that has been set in the regulations. So I think, especially more for the federations, and in this case for the Egyptian Federation, probably it will have flexibility to adjust a new period following the rule and what has been in place. What is interesting also is, I think, from a practical perspective, and having looked also at the situation, is there will be players that, for example, the players that this Portuguese club that I said told them they don't need to return. So basically the registration in Portugal would terminate at the end of the contract, 30th of June. I think it will be interesting to see what's going to happen, because probably the clubs, their original clubs, the clubs under which they have the contract, will not be able to register them in principle for the time being, because until the championship is over, the registration of new players probably will not be accepted. So players will not be able to, let's say, to play official football. So let's see exactly this. Again, our guidelines, I think FIFA, what intended to do was to provide some flexibility, not be very strict what's going to happen, protect integrity of competitions, also protect a little bit the regulations. And I think, as Dan said, I think probably in the next weeks or month, once we understand what's going to happen with the competitions, I'm sure that we will have a little bit more clarity what's going to happen with the registrations.
Okay, Bernardo, so next part of the presentation, you will cover the Arabic part, what happened in the Middle East. I will ask my colleague Ahmed to give us an idea and a brief description of the way he sees this matter. First, before giving the floor to Ahmed, Bernardo, do you need to add something here?
No, I was going to say, maybe if there's already some questions, we can let us know what's the.
Okay, fine. So I'll leave the floor to Ahmed. I'll leave the floor to Ahmed to start, and then I will send you the questions that we are receiving.
Okay, perfect.
شكرا شريف، واشكركم جميعا على الدعوة الجميلة دي لتوضيح بعض الأمور الخاصة بتداعيات أزمة الكورونا. Thanks Bernardo for your information as well. Yong, it's my pleasure to share such type of experience in this epidemic timing. So I will start speaking in Arabic regarding to some operational issues and some legal issues from our point of view, and as per the current situation in the Middle East. احنا هنتكلم بشكل عام عن موضوع تداعيات الأزمة الحالية وتعليق النشاط الرياضي بسبب تأثيره على التزامات الأندية وعقود اللاعبين. هنطرح بعض النقاط، التحديات، وفي نفس الوقت بعض التوصيات، ولو في مجال للأسئلة احنا موجودين على استفساراتكم على الأسئلة. طبعا ما فيش شك ان الوضع الحالي الرياضي والمالي والصحي تأثير سلبي على موازنات الأندية، واللي بدوره ادى الى تراجع بشكل ملحوظ في مصادر الدخل المرصوده في الميزانيات الموسميه لكل على حده، وفضلا عن الخسائر والنفقات الكبيره اللي تكبدتها بعض المؤسسات الرياضيه في الفتره الحاليه مع مواجهه ازمه كورونا. هنطرح بعض الامور الخاصه او التحديات الخاصه بالوضع الحالي، على سبيل المثال موضوع المردود الاستثماري وضعفه، وتوقف العديد منها نتيجة تعليق النشاط الرياضي، وبالتالي التأثير السلبي المباشر على الوضع الاقتصادي، واللي بدوره هيؤدي إلى بعض المشاكل، قد يؤدي إلى بعض المشاكل القانونية والتعاقدية في علاقة الأندية باللاعبين والمدربين. النقطة الثانية كلفة صيانة الملاعب، على سبيل المثال من بعض التحديات كلفة صيانة الملاعب، يعني الضغط والطلبات على صيانة الملاعب على أساس نبتدي في النشاط مرة ثانية وبشكل منتظم هيؤدي إلى ارتفاع الكلفة، طبعا نظرا لوجود طلبات تبقى في نفس الوقت مع متزامنة مع عودة النشاط. توقف الكامل لإيرادات المباريات، احنا عارفين إن إيرادات المباريات العائدة من التذاكر والبث التلفزيوني برضه من ضمن مصادر الدخل المهمة اللي بيحطها الأندية في ميزانياتهم السنوية، وده برضه من ضمن التحديات المهمة جدا اللي لازم كل طرف يحطه في الحسبان عند عودة النشاط مرة ثانية. طبعا زيادة كلفة البوليسات التأمينية الصحية للاعبين، شركات التأمين بقى عندها دلوقتي أظن خبرة كافية من خلال الشهرين اللي فاتوا دول على تداعيات الأزمة والوباء نفسه. الفيفا لما تناول الموضوع ده تناوله بشكل حط جايد لاينز أو حط بعض النقاط المهمة والمعايير الأساسية اللي لازم الأندية تتبعها مع اللاعبين علشان يتفادوا أي مساءلة ومشاكل قانونية. فهنتكلم بشكل مختصر على توصيات الفيفا والمعايير اللي اتكلمت فيها. كانت من أهمها معيار إن في هل وجود محاولة حقيقية وجدية من قبل الأندية للتواصل مع اللاعبين والمدربين لحل ودي، وده المعيار الأول والمعيار المهم جدا، إن يبقى في حسن نية في التعامل، مش آخد من الأزمة دي سبب إن أنا مباشرة أخصم بالعكس لازم يكون في سبب جدي وفعلي حاصل ان انا اقدر اتفق مع اللاعبين ان انا اخصم متساوي. الوضع المالي للنادي في ظل الظرف ده برضو من ضمن المعايير اللي الفيفا بيقيس عليها المشكله في حال وصول الموضوع لنزاع تعاقدي بين طرفين. والاهم من كده موضوع مركز صافي الدخل للاعبين، يعني المبلغ اللي بعد الخصم هيوفر للاعب حياه كريمه، في عداله في التوزيع، في تناسب وفي تسويه ما بين اللاعبين في الخصم او لا. وبطريقه ممكن نعمل، طبعا الفيفا بيقول لك انها ممكن نتمكن من ايجاد حلول عادله متوازنه في جميع الحالات. السلطه التقديريه ترجع لقاضي الموضوع في حال وجود نزاع على اساس المعايير اللي تم التطرق اليها عليها. التوصية في الحالة دي وفي المقام الأول البدء فورا في الاجتماع باللاعبين والمدربين وإثبات حسن النية والمحاولات الفعلية للتوصل لحل يرضي الطرفين وبشكل ودي. رقم 2 المساواة في نسب الخصم بحيث إنه ما يكونش فيه تفضيل للاعب على لاعب آخر. رقم 3 إثبات إن الوضع المالي للنادي اتأثر بشكل ما في إن هو يأهل النادي إن هو يقوم بسداد التزاماته التعاقدية والمالية. وبالنسبة للتوصية الأهم إن احنا نتفادى الموضوع ده من خلال بعض القوانين وبعض المواد القانونية في النظم الأساسية للاتحادات المختلفة، بحيث إن هو يتم النص صراحة في النظام الأساسي لكل اتحاد على حدة فيما يخص موضوع الظروف القاهرة أو في موضوع الأزمات اللي بنواجهها في الوضع الراهن. وعلى الطرف الاخر موضوع عقود اللاعبين، وده المفترض ان احنا او عقود المدربين ان احنا نتطرق له في ورش ثانيه نتكلم فيها عن ان يتم نص صراحه على انه في حال على سبيل المثال انه وجود ظرف قاهر او زي ما بنقول ظاهره زي الظاهره موجوده الفتره دي، هيبقى في نسبه معينه او نسبه مذكوره باتفاق الطرفين بحيث ان احنا نتفادى فيما بعد اي مشاكل او استفسارات قانونية قد تؤدي إلى الوصول للمحاكم. وفي سؤال تاني يمكن أغلب الناس يمكن هيكون غايب عن بالهم الموضوع ده. لو أنا عندي لعيب على سبيل المثال معار من نادي لنادي آخر، والنادي المعير بيتحمل جزء من راتب اللاعب والنادي المستعير بيتحمل جزء المتبقي من راتب اللاعب، وكل نادي من الأندية من الناديين دول ليه معيار معين أو ليه نسبة معينة، هل هيتأثر الموضوع أو هل هيبقى فيه مشكلة ولازم الناديين يلتزموا بنفس نسبة الخصم ولا لا؟ فالموضوع ده متروك غالبا هيكون للسلطة التقديرية لقاضي الموضوع، بس في نفس الوقت والطبيعي اللي يحصل ان بعد اتباع كل نادي على حدة المعايير عليه ومناسبتها ليه وحسب المعطيات، فكل نادي بيطبق الخصم بحسب المعايير الموجودة عليه. بس دي كانت المشاركة اللي ممكن أقدر أحاول إن أنا أوصل لكم بيها فكرتنا، وفي نفس الوقت المجال مطروح للأسئلة لو في أي استفسار أي حاجة قانونية حابين نتناقش فيها إحنا جاهزين.
طيب إحنا شكرا يا أحمد. أستاذ محمد المهيري لو ممكن يدينا فكرة عن كيفية تعامل دولة الإمارات اتحاد الكرة في دولة الإمارات مع الوضع ده، واعتقد ان الاتحاد في الامارات ادى بعض التوجيهات للانديه، فخلينا ناخد الميكروفون يتنقل للاستاذ محمد ويدينا فكره سريعه، وبنشكره اولا طبعا على تواجده معنا.
نعم، شكرا الاخ شريف. الحقيقه الموضوع تداعيات موضوع فيروس كورونا أمر حدث في العالم ككل، وتأثر العالم كله بالتأثير السلبي اللي كلنا نشوفه نحن. وطبعا كل القطاعات في كل يعني الأوجه المختلفة للنشاطات تأثرت، وبالذات يعني النشاط الرياضي. طبعا كلنا نعرف أن كل الدول وكل الاتحادات وكل الهيئات الرياضية تندرج تحت مظلة الاتحاد الدولي. الاتحاد الدولي طبعا وضع معايير، ووضع مثل ما تفضل الأخ أحمد مشكورا تكلم عن التعميم اللي صدر من الاتحاد الدولي. طبعا اتحاد دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة لكرة القدم شأن كافة الاتحادات أخذ الإجراءات اللي تتماشى وطبعا في ظل المعايير والإجراءات اللي الاتحاد الدولي طبعا وضعها في تعميم اللي كان بتاريخ 7 أبريل 2020. التأثير الرئيسي صار في 3 مثل ما نقول أنشطة أو 3 محاور من محاور العملية الرياضية بالذات يعني في كرة القدم. المحور الأول في تصوري أنا، وطبعا التعميم تكلم عنه، اللي هو يتعلق بالعقود، عقود اللاعبين وعقود المدربين، من طبعا نواحي اللي هي تتعلق بانتهاء هذه العقود، أو أيضا بالعقود الجديدة اللي كانت المفروض الاندية تتعاقد فيها. أيضا تطرق التداعيات الأزمة في رواتب اللعيبة، رواتب اللاعبين والمدربين سواء كانوا الأجانب أو المحليين. وأيضا تعلق في الموسم الرياضي، البطولات الرياضية وتوقف النشاط الرياضي بما فيه أيضا التدريبات. فيما يتعلق في موضوع الرواتب على سبيل المثال، طبعا احنا أخذنا التعميم الاتحاد الدولي، وأول معيار كان الاتفاق بين الأطراف. الاتفاق سواء بين طبعا نحن تقسم الموضوع إلى ناحيتين، الناحية اللي تتعلق باللاعبين الأجانب والمدربين الأجانب، وهذا تم يعني بالكامل تنظيمه تحت اللي هي القواعد والمعايير اللي وضعها الاتحاد الدولي، فما تتدخل الاتحاد الإماراتي بشكل رئيسي فيما يتعلق باللاعبين الأجانب والمدربين الأجانب، وأحاله بالكامل إلى المعايير الدولية والأحكام اللي تطرق لها التعميم الخاص بالاتحاد الدولي. بالنسبة للاعبين المحليين كان التوجه أن في البداية يضع الأمر إلى الاتفاق والحل الودي، اتفاق اللاعب مع النادي. في حال طبعا عدم الاتفاق وضع الاتحاد الإماراتي، وهذا القرار طبعا موجود في الموقع الإلكتروني للاتحاد، وبحيث أنه لا يقوم النادي بتخفيض الراتب اللاعب بما يفوق 40%. كان معيار 40% هو الحد الأقصى في حال لم يتم الاتفاق بين اللاعب وبين النادي على مبلغ معين بالنسبة للراتب، فيتم التخفيض بما لا يزيد عن 40%، مع وضع بالاعتبار أيضا لا يقل عن مبلغ معين للاعب اللي يكفل له الحياة الكريمة واللي يكفل له المعيشة المناسبة في دولة الإمارات. طبعا اللاعبين لهم فئات معينة، كل في فئته سقف الراتب أو الحد الأدنى من التخفيض في الراتب لا يعني يكون أقل من راتب معين حسب الفئات اللاعبة اللي فيها. طبعا في حال عدم الاتفاق بين اللاعب وبين النادي في تخفيض الراتب. طبعا المعايير اللي وضعها الاتحاد الدولي التزم فيها ايضا التعميم الصدر من اتحاد كرة القدم، اللي هي لابد من وجود محاولات جادة من النادي في الحل الودي، وإثبات مبدأ حسن النية، أيضا الوضع المالي للنادي والوضع المالي للاعبين كلها في عين الاعتبار. أما فيما يتعلق بالعقود، عقود اللاعبين طبعا والمدربين، عقود اللاعبين والمدربين الاتحاد الدولي واتحاد دولة الإمارات أيضا أخذ نفس المعايير اللي وضعها التعميم الاتحاد الدولي، وهي امتداد هذه العقود إلى الوقت الذي سيسمح فيه باستمرار النشاط. هي كلها ارتبطت في بعضها البعض، النشاط الرياضي والبطولات الرياضية وامتداد العقود وأيضا العقود الجديدة. فلو نحن عادة في دولة الإمارات ينتهي الموسم الرياضي بنهاية شهر 6 اللي هو شهر يوليو، عفوا شهر اللي هو شهر شو اللي قبل يوليو راح عني
يونيو.
نعم شهر يونيو. it's much easy for me to speak in English، لكن لما تكلمنا كنا بالعربي القسم العربي فظلنا end of June usually ينتهي الموسم الرياضي عندنا، ولكن إذا امتد لحد الآن لم يعلن الاتحاد عن انتهاء الموسم الرياضي، فهو سيمتد إلى امتداد الوضع الاحترازي اللي موجود بالنسبة لموضوع الفيروس كورونا. هذا تقريبا ايضا العقود الجديده سمح الاتحاد ايضا بتوقيع العقود الجديده وتاجيل تنفيذها ببدايه الموسم القادم. الموسم القادم ايضا عاده يعني يبتدي في سبتمبر، ولكن السنة هذه أيضا ليس واضح لحد الآن متى حيبتدي الموسم القادم إن شاء الله. هذه تقريبا يعني المداخلة اللي أنا يعني جهزتها اليوم، وإذا في أي أسئلة من أي أحد من الإخوان أنا مستعد وحاضر، وشكرا.
شكرا أستاذ محمد، بنشكر حضرتك، واعتقد احنا كده غطينا الموضوع وبنفتح الباب لو في اسئله. انا في سؤال هوجهه لبرناردو ودان. Bernardo, there is one question regarding loans. In case of the loan of a player that will gets extended as a result of the current situation, is the club loaning the player entitled to negotiate in terms of the extension, or it should automatically go ahead and proceed, only the player gets salary?
I think following what we said from the beginning, there's no automatic extension of the loan. I think that's the first thing we need to state. What basically, because terms of the contracts obviously are to be respected. What FIFA is saying is that if the competition extends, which at the moment, at least in Europe, it's what the federations are trying to do. There are some exceptions, but in general, UEFA is asking the federations to try to continue the championships. So basically, the guidelines applicable are saying what we recommend is to extend, and that needs an agreement between club and player, and obviously the club that holds the player. I think naturally that if the club that owes the player only wants to extend with a certain payment, this is all about negotiation. I think what needs to be analyzed here is probably the new or the club that has the player on loan will, unless it's let's say one of the first team players, eventually in a period where there's no income, they will probably have to assess if it's justified or reasonable to not only pay more salary but also to pay another loan fee. But I think objectively it's negotiations between club about the loan and between club and player about the extension of the employment contract, and everything is about negotiations. So yes,
thank you.
Answering, the club can ask for a new loan fee for the small period of the extension. I would say in practice that it needs to be verified if it's reasonable or not.
Okay, thanks, Bernardo. We have another question. It's related to any compensation or support that the FIFA might grant to the federation that got hurt with the pandemic. Is there such an initiative? And if yes, when is it expected to be paid?
I think Dan could jump in, but from my understanding, I think FIFA already said that. I think UEFA as well. They are analyzing the situation and trying to put up a fund that will be able to help stakeholders, but there's no specific information. But I think Dan is the right person to answer that.
Yeah,
Dan,
well, although I don't work for FIFA myself as well, so I don't have all the insights out, but what I do know is that FIFA has already been contacting all of its federations to ask for financial information clarifying the extent to what it has been impacted financially due to the crisis. So I think they're now busy with this assessment, with the research, and following which the federations will know, I guess, more details anytime soon about what FIFA aims to do with this fund, about which they have been talking about over the last weeks.
Great. One more question. It's about the percentages. Let's, in case of the continuity of the seasons, and after reaching an agreement on some discounts, is this gonna be subject to further negotiation or it's gonna be fixed?
خليني شريف اوضح لك نقطه بسيطه بس في الموضوع ده. الحاله اللي احنا فيها دي حاله مؤقته. نسبه الخصم هتبقى موجوده لحد استمرار النشاط. وانس النشاط رجع مره ثانيه بيسقط على طول تطبيق شرط الخصم. فاعتقد ان نفس الموضوع ده تبناه حتى الاتحاد الاماراتي، ان هو معلق موضوع تطبيق الخصم على انتهاء الازمه او استمراريه النشاط ايهما اقل.
تمام. بنشكركم جميعا. انا الاسئله اللي عندي كده covered اتغطت كلها.
Just one last question.
فاضل سؤال كمان.
One last question just before we conclude.
Wrap up.
This is for Dan and Bernardo, if you can help us. Now the situation that some federations, they have announced that they are going to resume their activities in May and some in June, and I believe Holland, the last one in September. So does this make any difference? I mean, in the negotiations, I mean, if people are going to have their matches resumed next month, do they still need to make any extensions, or do they still need to negotiate for the prices? So even if they resume, my question is, even if they resume their activities again and football comes back to the pitch and the stadiums, will these also negotiations or the extension of contracts and reduction of the salaries will still be available? or not? Bernardo and Dan, if you can give us your thoughts about this.
I'll first give my let's say my practical experience. I think, for example, 2 of the 3 major football clubs in Portugal have already reached an agreement with their players to reduce 40% of the salary, but it's 40% that is fully reimbursable under certain conditions. Both clubs have agreed on the same principle, which is 20% it's immediately reimbursed if the championship resumes, and the other 20% under some sporting results. So obviously you can see that here it depends if, on one hand, if the championship resumes, because I think that there are some discussions, if I'm not mistaken, Holland, Belgium, and some other countries about eventually terminating the competition. So that would mean that, for example, the 20% that were agreed to be paid back if the competition resumed are not going to be paid back. So I think that, yes, I think the answer is resuming the competitions will play, I think, a role in the negotiations. And I think also, depending if it will only resume for the next season or not. So I think we need to divide in both. So I think as I think Dan, unfortunately, he had to leave. He had another commitment, so he had set for an hour, but I think I can answer. This is, again, it's all about negotiations, and it's all about now trying to understand if the current championship is going to resume, or if we're just talking about the future season and future perspective. I think it would also be interesting to see what Mr. Al-Nahiri thinks about this, and also from his experience locally. And I think he could answer in English, so I can also discuss.
Thank you, Bernardo.
Thank you, Bernardo. Thanks, Dan.
But wait, no, but let me. I was asking what Mr. Al-Nahiri thinks also about this specific situation.
Okay.
More in the Middle East, because I think it's also interesting from a general perspective to see the differences.
Yeah, he can speak in English.
Yes, and I was asking to speak in English, so
I would love to speak in English, but yes. I was attempted by Ahmed when he started to speak in Arabic, so I thought it will be easy for me to speak in Arabic. But sometimes it's the other way around. It's much easier to speak in English. Thank you, Bernardo. Yeah, I agree with you. This is really a very tricky, if I may use this term, situation, because still early. If I speak, what is the situation here in UAE? That the decision to end the current season has not been yet taken. And then there will be another, issues which might arise because of ending the season or ending the championship. What will be the results of those clubs which are still in the competition, and then which one will be the those clubs which has to go to the first league, from the Premier League, and those 2 clubs which usually has to come from the the lower league to the upper league. There are so many issues will arise. So I personally think that we hope this situation is very short and temporary, that we can resume the current season as soon as possible, so we can shrink the remaining matches as we can minimize those days between each match for each club, as the normal 3 days gaps from a match and another match which we are following might be, changes in a way or another. I think, as Ahmed also mentioned in his comments, that this is all temporary, measures, which, in case this, season is going to be a little bit delay within those 6 weeks windows for the registration of the new players. I think we will be in a better position that all the financial commitments, all the contracts, all the dates, all this will be respected.
Yes, perfect. I fully agree. I fully agree. And I think the general overview, I think, Sharif, that we also need to take here is, first, we have some guidelines that I think are very helpful, but it's all about negotiations. And I think on discussions this week with a couple of colleagues, we said that it's a very good time for football to suddenly have very good common sense. Sometimes we talk about high salaries and high transfers and everything, and now maybe it's the time to relax and bring some common sense. So everything is about negotiation. So all the clubs that are currently starting to tackle the situation, it's about also common sense and listening to the players and reaching common goals. And then again, as was said, we'll hopefully have this situation resumed soon and we can go back to normal life. And I think what I think we can take from then as well that is very interesting is we can expect to have more guidelines, I think, in the near future, once at least we understand from, let's say, national and health authorities when and how this can be resumed. So I think that's also quite interesting for me, because I think at least we have the guidelines, and probably as time passes by, we will have some more directives, and I think we can also adjust to that. So I think that's also very interesting.
Thank you, Bernardo. As you rightly said, it's a really unusual situation, but it's interesting to discuss matters that were not expected and see how the regulation evolves and how to develop these regulations to accommodate such situation in any future situation like this. Ahmed, you wanted to add something?
I would love to ask something which is for Bernardo. If Yonge was here, it will be also
relevant
to say useful, and Mr. Mohammed Al-Mahiri as well, and also to anyone from the Egyptian Federation. What is the definition of the monthly salary which shall be imposed to a deduction? Shall it include the basic salary or the basic and the advance payment or signing on fee? As well, I would like to ask how it could be calculated if there is, like, for example, some paid. So this deduction shall have influence on those allowances, on the advance payment, on the signing on fee, or on the basic salary. It should be imposed to this deduction. So it's like, I'd like to ask Mr. Mohammed Al-Mahiri from his point of view, just to clarify, not to confirm something, just to clarify it. And Bernardo, as a lawyer, if you have a case as a lawyer and analyzing in front of the DRC, as well, De Jong as a judge.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. Thank you.
I
personally think it's an impact on the full financial capacity of the club or the player or whatever. So if a case, for example, came in front of me, as Abu Aziz wanted to introduce me at the beginning, saying a senior legal advisor in the CAS. No, I'm a senior legal advisor and an arbitrator member of a CAS. I am the current UAE member of as an arbitrator in a CAS. So I think if personally I got a case in front of me, then I really need to look into those three main guidelines which the FIFA has, you know, already established on this domain, you know, the financial status of the club, you know, and also the financial status of the player, and the, you know, the attempts which has been done for such reduction. I personally believe that it has to go into the compensation, the monthly salary of the players, regardless of the, you know, what could be like you know, the down payment of a contract, or for example, there might be some other, you know, non-financial benefits which might some of the players enjoy. This personally, I think I will go into the monthly total financial compensation of the player. Thank you, Ahmed.
You're most welcome. Please, from your point of view.
Yeah, look, I fully agree. I fully agree. I think there's no right answer, but if you look at the guidelines, there's also no specificity. So as it was, I think for me, very correctly said, you look at the contract, look at the guidelines, and normally we look at the entire monthly compensation. And then from that perspective, we can see what can be impacted or not. From a practical perspective, I had some clients that were part of these negotiations, and our concern was, I think the discussion was, yeah, it comprises everything, but if there's some bonus that are bonus related to, let's say, classification in the league, those are not monthly, so those remain the same. But if you have monthly bonus for participation in matches, obviously those bonus are affected, and they need to be addressed exactly like
what about the allowances?
And allowances the same, and allowances I think the same. But I think you need, again, as we said, some common sense as well, because for example, and this is just my personal general overview, and again I think I repeat, as it was said also by Mr. Al-Mhairi's, case by case contract and guidelines. Let's not jump into any conclusion here because we shouldn't, but an allowance of a house allowance, I think it can be, because it's a monthly thing, but there needs to be a common sense from the club, because maybe it's really used to pay the house. So how much can you reduce? Where is the limit? So it's a monthly compensation. I think everything is comprised, and then you need to address, I think, each topic specifically, considering how is it going to affect also the player individually.
So it's going to be like a base-to-base case?
I think so. As it was
so
said,
the percentage should be on the salary, whatever the definition of the salary.
Look, I think the way I look at it, it depends. I think from the financial perspective, one thing is really the salary and the bonus and everything. Then the allowances, because sometimes, for example, as far as I understand, sometimes clubs, they don't pay a house allowance, but they provide for an apartment. They will not gonna I don't know, eliminate part of the apartment.
You can now it for 5 minutes and bring it back.
You can only use one room of the apartment now. I think
we'll pay for 2 rooms only.
That's not gonna happen. So I think it's common sense. One thing is really the financial thing, and that comprises everything. I fully agree. And then it's a case-by-case situation. I think that's how I think you need to look into it. But each contract is a contract, and it needs to be taken into account the specificities of each contract.
We have to have so many sessions for the contracts, especially to avoid.
Yeah, I agree. Fully agree. I think that's about it. We have reached our timing. Thank you very much for being part of this. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Bernardo. Thanks, Mr. Meheri. Mr. Ahmed, thank you very much. I would also like my colleague Ines from the Egyptian Federation of Sports Culture to thank you personally.
Thank you so much. We're really happy to have you with us. It has been such a great session for us, from highly reputable and elite experts as yourselves. The input you have provided us is so rich and valuable, and we thank you for your time. Thank you.
You are most welcome. It's our pleasure. Anytime. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ramadan Kareem.
يا رب رمضان كريم علينا وعليك.
الله يسلمكم.